today we are really excited to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Ilardi, author of The Depression Cure. He has a new edition coming out. His first one was in 2009, and it will be coming out sometime, I think, in August of 2025. He is a clinical psychologist, neuroscientist, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Kansas. After earning his doctorate in psychology from Duke University in 1995, he launched a career devoted to uncovering the neurobiological roots of major depressive disorder and translating that science into practical interventions for everyday life. The TLC program blends research around cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and clinical trials, positioning him as a leading voice in lifestyle-based approaches to mental health. Fascinating fellow. I have heard about him for several years. I knew about the Depression Cure, had read the Depression Cure, and then my youngest son, Luke, had him as a professor for 3 classes during his time at KU. And one time during one of those conversations, I made the connection that Dr. Ilardi was Dr. Ilardi. And then we reached out to him and asked him to be a guest to talk about that. And so today we'll be talking about the Depression Cure. And then actually he's going to come back on with us and talk about AI and psychotherapy. So we are very excited for you to meet Dr. Ilardi, and here we go.
And when I'm working with somebody with depression, when they walk in and they're suffering, and I know their pain circuits in their brain are lit up, and I know they're in agony, they may be fantasizing about death as an escape. They've lost things that matter to them, and they're hopeless. And in my mind's eye, a little piece of my brain is envisioning what they're going to look like 2 months down the road or 3 months down the road.
Yeah, me too.
And it sustains me, and it gives me this sort of courage and this groundedness of like, okay, it sucks right now, but that's not the end of the story, you know?
My Inner Knowing, empowering you to find your compass for the journey. We are dedicated to supporting you to rediscover and trust your natural ability to navigate life each day by sharing insight and experience through the lens of 2 professional communicators and their guests. We intend to prompt internal inquiry that supports all those willing to explore a unique path.
So welcome, Dr. Ilardi. Thank you for joining us today. I have been looking forward to this interview for months.
Oh, you're so kind. Thank you. I'm very happy right now. It's a pleasure to be with you both, and with your audience, and looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you. So what I was thinking about was when we go into the therapy room, that's what we were talking about before we got rolling. And that presence that is, I believe, so important for a clinician to be able to hold. And what I was thinking when you were sharing was how much practice and training and self-awareness that I had to go through early in my career to learn how to really learn to be present with a client in the room, how to be aware when I wasn't present. What do I do to help my body be more present? And so for me, several things that I did were around sensory stuff to really train my body, essentially conditioning it that when I sit in this chair and I do these things, I want this kind of presence in the room. So
absolutely, yeah. So for me, I did my my graduate training in clinical psychology, a PhD program at Duke University. And from I started in 1990, and I was a little bit of a second career student. So I was 27. I'd been background was math and computer science and economics,
Mm-hmm.
and had worked at CDC, Center for Disease Control, had worked for Wells Fargo Bank, had done commercial real estate valuation, never taken a psych class until I was 24. Started volunteering at a psychiatric hospital after work at the recommendation of a friend of mine, a lifelong friend, a good friend from first grade. And we were talking, and I was 24, and I was like, I hate my job. And he's like, well, they pay you a lot. And I said, yeah, but like, I need to feel like I'm doing something worthwhile and meaningful. And I just feel like everything I'm spending my energy on just feels very empty. And he said, well, he was a psych major, which I used to tease him about. So draw your own inferences about karma at this point. But he said, well, there's this psychiatric hospital. This was in Atlanta, where I'd gone to undergrad at Emory University in Atlanta. And there was a state psychiatric hospital with very, very severe patients, and many of whom had been hospitalized for decades. And in fact, I signed up to volunteer on a unit. They said, well, we really need the most volunteer help on a unit that most of the patients are NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity.
Wow.
And I said, okay, sure. I was fearless. And it changed my life. I mean, just hanging out every week. So I said, well, what's my job? And they said, just be present with these. And most of these patients are psychotic. And I said, I don't know what that means.
Right. Right.
And, I learned very quickly.
Yes.
Many of them had a diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizoaffective, other adjacent sorts of disorders. And they said, just be present. Most of these patients are cut off from their families. They're never going to leave the hospital.
Yeah.
And nobody cares about them, other than maybe staff, hopefully, or other patients. And it just kind of pulled me down this rabbit hole. Like, okay, here are these fellow travelers who are, they're fellow human beings. They have the same array of emotional experience, the same magnitude of hopes and dreams, and yet they were tormented often by experiences of hallucination, things that weren't there, that they perceived to be real, and delusional thoughts, and I was just absolutely smitten with like, I want to work in this area. Like, this is a profound, and it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to work with psychotic patients, schizophrenic patients, but or those who, most of them had committed some pretty serious crimes, but while they were under the influence of delusions. And I just thought, well, this is a source of incredible suffering for lots and lots of people. And it feels like we're just getting a scientific toehold in, this understanding of the brain and the mind. And because I had a programming background, the neuroscientific angle, as I started reading on my own, it was like, oh, okay, I get it. The brain is like, not exactly hardware, but like wetware, and the mind, our perceptions and memories and judgments are like more or less like software. I think we're learning that more and more every day with AI, which we can talk about later. But it gave me a set of intuitions off the shelf of like, okay, like I have a set of heuristics or rules of thumb, ways of understanding the mind-brain connection that felt very intuitive and sort of almost obvious in the sense of like, yeah, this is a really, really hard set of problems, but there are lives at stake, and there's been suffering on the line. So I would be honored to devote my career to this sort of thing. and took 3 psych classes at night school, and just had the audacity. Took the GRE, luckily did pretty well. And this is back in the day when you could do. I don't even think this could be done anymore, because the bar is so high now to get into a PhD program in clinical, typically. But I mean, I got into most places I applied.
Wow.
I didn't know what the hell. I mean, I didn't know the game. So on my application, my personal statement, my essays, they're like, well, what sorts of things are you interested in doing? And, PhD program is a research-oriented program. And I'm like, well,
right.
I had done some research at CDC, Center for Disease Control. That was my work study job as an undergrad, because I'm going to this fancy, expensive school from a very middle-class background. My parents couldn't afford it, but between scholarship and work study and, all kinds of things. But I had a research background at CDC, and they counted it. And my essay, I just said, well, I'm really interested in personality disorders. And the professor who became my mentor at Duke, where I ended up going, was a depression researcher who had recently become obsessed with the intersection between personality functioning and depression, both risk factor, protective factor, moderator of clinical outcome, personality disorder as a vulnerability factor to recurrence, all kinds of. So he and I met, and he's like, well, you're interested in personality. I guess that's personality disorder. I'm like, yeah, sure. We'll go with that. And it just became this fantastic fit. Okay, I think I can land the plane here, all the way back to your original question, which was about presence, clinical presence, right? And while we're sitting with folks that we have a hopefully healing relationship with, and they're coming to us in their pain, and they're turning to us as, hopefully, partly just as fellow travelers, but also as those who have specialized training and expertise. And I was lucky enough to be at the Med Center there when Marcia Linehan, I don't know if that name.
Oh, yeah.
She's very famous in the field as the originator of dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and as one of the most influential clinicians when it comes to integrating mindfulness-based practices and in different therapy protocols, and so I was one of the early adopters in an outpatient program for patients with borderline personality disorder, which is, I don't know how much to assume your audience would know about it, but really turbulent, really affects functioning in a lot of different domains, including interpersonally. And I walked into this setting as a trainee, and it's like, this is a really difficult patient population. And I'm not a centered person easily by nature. I'm, my Buddhist friends would say I have monkey mind, I'm kind of like all over the place. And I learned really quickly, like, no. Like, you got to walk in, and really locked in. And my first supervisor said, how in many of the martial arts, the first thing you learn is how to be centered, how to have your body centered on the ground on which you're standing, centered in your stance and balanced. And that if you are centered and balanced, it doesn't matter what somebody throws at you. With appropriate training, you are able to address that, maybe deflect it, or depending, turn it back on them. And you'll hardly have to use any effort. You're because you're centered and balanced. Like, you could just deflect, redirect the energy coming at you. And if you're not balanced, you're toast. Like you're going to get knocked over so easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, man, that is a beautiful analogy for what it's like walking into a therapy setting.
Mm-hmm.
Also, for me as a university professor, walking into a classroom setting, because, you know, I mean, a lot of our students, they're really good at challenging. They're really good at critically thinking, but also many of them have their own mental health struggles.
Yeah.
And, you know, so whenever we're talking about these sorts of topics, man, they don't hold back. They're, you know, they're really, really engaged and interested and curious. So,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm just kind of rambling, but
No.
that brings it back around to, like, I mean, it resonates so much with me, this idea that when we walk into a healing setting, we have to really be centered, we have to be balanced, and then we have to be fully present. And I mean, this is a little bit off topic maybe, but hopefully relevant to that point. I was talking to a junior colleague very recently, a therapist out in the community, and she was talking about her level of burnout, which is a real thing for a lot of therapists. And it, for whatever reason, it had not ever really been fully internalized for her that, like, there's nothing in this that's about you, really, as the clinician. It's like I mean, I'm probably overstating it, but like that your mandate, your calling, your mission is to be there for this patient as best you can. That doesn't mean that you don't bring your full self into that moment, that you don't bring sometimes, every once in a while, your own vulnerabilities. Every once in a while, a little bit of self-disclosure when it serves the patient, you know. And it really struck me in that moment. It's like, she didn't get that in her training.
Right.
Like, this is not about you at all.
Right.
And so if you can't be fully present for the patient, you know, then take that really seriously. Get yourself fed, get yourself, you know, whatever you need, so that when you walk into that session, it's not about you.
Oh, Steve, sorry. Whew, I could talk about this for hours, this topic. And I know that's not what we're talking about today, but
I know do you, I mean, I saw you nodding, so I hope for your listeners' sake, they don't feel you're sitting there going, oh man.
No, Steve, I'm actually writing a book about that right now.
What?
So I am absolutely right. In process.
Well, I'll just, amen.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle. I often say, I don't think universities are teaching therapists what this job is anymore. And maybe they didn't in the past. I don't know. But I hear you. It resonates completely.
I can tell you in my training, it was loud and clear. It was, it was just, could not have been more strongly emphasized. Like, you need to have the mindset of you are there for this person who's come to you in a state of incredible vulnerability often. Incredible, I mean, there's a really old book that was very influential in its day by a psychiatrist named Jerome Frank called Persuasion and Healing. And he talks in there about how the typical patient will come to us in a state of what he referred to as demoralization, which he characterized as a confluence of helplessness and hopelessness. Helpless in the sense that there's something that they're suffering with, something that's troubling them, and they've exhausted their repertoire trying to get better. Like, they've done everything they can think of to, and it's still there.
Right.
So that, they're feeling helpless, like, oh, I can't figure this out. I can't get it on my own. Hopeless in a sense of like, well, it hasn't gotten better, and I don't even know if it ever can get better. And then they come to the he called them the culturally sanctioned healer. I'm using air quotes now. The cultural, because he said you can apply the same principles to traditional healers in any shamanistic healers or traditional healer, that like they have been sanctioned by the culture as like you have the mantle. Maybe you have the priestly robes, whatever. I guess in a med center you have the white lab coat, and the modern priestly robe. And it's like, all right, part of your job then is to instill a sense of hope, instill a sense of, okay, like this may seem hopeless, but there's a way out.
Yes.
And I'm committed as the healer. I'm committed to being there for you. Help with that. And, for me as someone who specialized in clinical depression, and treated hundreds and hundreds of patients, I have the incredible good fortune to be pretty optimistic by nature, but not like irrationally confident or irrationally like I like to think of myself as an optimistic realist, but what I mean by that is like I had a professor in grad school who said, is this okay, Walker?
It's good. Just great.
Okay.
Yeah. He just knows I'm loving what you're saying, Steve. That's really what he's
interlude. She has been like a kid before Christmas, actually. So.
I was thinking, well, we got our trial attorney here, and like, I object, Your Honor.
No, I'm thrilled. This is great. I told her in advance. I said, you're both professionals. You're in an arena that I have experienced in only as a recipient of services, but in any event, no, I'm thrrilled. So please proceed.
Okay. Yeah. And I'll explain more when you're finished, but go ahead.
Well, I was just about to launch into another little insider story of, back in first year grad school, I had the professor who taught a class that I teach right now called Advanced Psychopathology. So it's first year grad school, whirlwind tour of all the mental illnesses, like reading lots of original scholarly articles, yada, yada. And we get to depression and, we have all the articles, we come in, we've all done our reading, and he just looks us dead in the eye. It's 8 of us around this table and him. And he's like, I just got to level with you all. He's like, I don't treat anybody with depression. That whole emotional contagion thing. They start going on about like how hopeless everything and how dark. And he's like, and I'm just sitting there nodding my head like, yeah, it's awful. It sucks. And, and then I'll leave and we're both in worse shape. Wow. I loved his honesty.
Yeah.
Because it kind of built on a bigger point, which he said, which again, we could go down this rabbit hole. We probably won't, but bigger point for your listeners is every therapist probably has their kryptonite.
Yes.
Metaphorically or figuratively, like, we probably all as therapists have certain kinds of disorders or conditions that we're not very well suited to working with.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, from our backstory, our personality, whatever. And then we probably all have I know this is cheesy. I hope it's not cringe, but like we all have our superpowers. We all have our for whatever reason, who knew? But I'm like really effective with this population.
Right.
And so I heard just being thrown into the fire, like, I really am strangely immune to the emotional contagion of depression. And let me bracket that, because that could sound really callous, and I don't mean that at all. I am moved by it.
Right.
It makes me sad to be in the presence of someone who's really suffering, but it doesn't overwhelm me and it doesn't stay with me.
Right.
So I can get back to equipoise, to equilibrium very quickly.
Yes.
Even if I'm leading a depression group session one, everybody around the table is in incredible pain
Yeah.
for 2 hours, and I'm there, and I'll have a I've done this several times. I'll have a grad student trainee in the room, and then we debrief after, and they're just sitting there like, oh my God, that was just so much. And I'm like, yeah, I know, you will develop an emotional immune system, but it only goes so far, depending on the person. So anyway, I am an optimist by nature. And when I'm working with somebody with depression, when they walk in and they're suffering, and I know their pain circuits in the brain are lit up, and I know they're in agony, they may be fantasizing about death as an escape. They've lost things that matter to them, and they're hopeless. And in my mind's eye, a little piece of my brain is envisioning what they're going to look like 2 months down the road or 3 months down the road.
Yeah, me too.
And it sustains me, and it gives me this sort of courage and this groundedness of like, okay, it sucks right now, but that's not the end of the story,
Have you ever felt confused or overwhelmed in relationships? Teresa and I have come up with a free mini course that we think will really help you out with a lot of the common relationship experiences so that you can improve your communication skills with all of the people in your life and really make a change for the better.
Yeah, we really believe that everybody deserves the opportunity to learn healthy relationship skills so that we can get through life having a good, healthy relationship experience. So click the link, put your email in, you'll get the PDF, spend a few hours working on it, and please let us know what your experience is. We know it will benefit you in some way. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
I thought that one was pretty good.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Check.
And so I don't know. I find that really, really important. I don't, and I don't judge therapists or clinicians or just lay folks, because I think the same differences exist, in people with their friends and family. Like some people just have an incredible gift of being able to be present with others when they're hurting.
Yeah.
Without being, and just to be a comfort and sort of an intuitive like intuitively, what do you need right now? Like, do you just need me to sit here with you in silence?
Yeah.
Do you need me to touch you on the arm? Do you need a hug? Do you want to talk? It's a gift. But I don't know. I guess it comes all the way back, Teresa, to the topic of your book. Like, when we walk into that therapy setting, is like, there's incredible potential for us, especially when somebody is I believe somebody's depressed. Of like, now we're playing for really big stakes, because depression robs people of their clear thinking, of their ability to work at their best, of their ability to love at their best temporarily, of their ability to be the best friend, or even to want to be around other people, of their ability, of their often of their sex drive, of their not only their zest for life, but just their desire to keep living. And it's the biggest cause of suicidality, which claims the lives of over 50,000 Americans every year, estimated 1 million people globally. So, the stakes are really, really high. And that never fails to, I don't know, it gets me up in the morning a lot of times, just thinking, okay, we're playing for keeps here.
Yeah.
There's a real responsibility there on your side of the couch, or however you set up your clinical setting. But also, you said something that I thought was it's really important, and that is the power of your optimistic hope, whether you state it or not, the fact that it's there, I think carries through to the person that's sitting across from you. And that holds so much to
Yeah,
understand that somebody believes that you will get better.
absolutely. Yeah. I think I love that you said whether you say it or whether I say it or not.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's because we're constantly reading each other's nonverbals.
Right.
You know, there's a way that you carry yourself. There's a way that you convey whether or not you believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure as a trial attorney, you know, you've really studied that when you're making a closing argument, you know, to a jury, like
in a crass way, we would say they can smell bullshit a mile away.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, and psychotherapy patients, you know, the same.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they really know. I mean, back to Teresa, part of what you were saying earlier, like they know whether or not you actually are there for them. They know whether you care, and they know whether you feel like you can offer them a path and join them on a path, you know, out of their suffering. And you know, that's part of why it's been really transformative for me, I would say, over my journey over the past 20 years or so, as a psychotherapy, as a treatment developer, as a protocol developer, because early in my career, I was a clinical neuroscientist. I mean, I was, you know, doing NIH-funded studies that maybe 50 people would read about, you know, because we were looking at like differences in hemispheric lateralization of processing. I mean, you know, and I was happy as a clam doing that. I thought it was like, oh, you know, that's how science works. Like you have your little tiny brick that you put in this grand edifice of all these discoveries, and it's totally fine. But I was doing a little bit of therapy on the side because I'm trained, you know, as a clinical psychologist. I'm a licensed therapist. And I was just doing a little, so I'm a university professor and just doing a little bit of psychotherapy. And my training, like so many therapists these days, probably the majority, was in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And had even taught national workshops in cognitive behavioral therapy. My academic advisor at Duke had trained with Aaron Beck, who's a really famous name in the field. He's the pioneer, the originator of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression. And that was, as the kids would say, some of them, you know, that was my jam. You know, it was like cognitive behavioral therapy. People get depressed. I mean, according to this model, people get depressed primarily because of the negative cascade of negative thoughts and extreme sorts of, you know, effects on behavior and so forth. And so the intervention, CBT, primarily focuses on helping people identify their negative thoughts, which are, you know, legion in depression. Identify them and then learn to, so being mindful, I guess, although that's not the language that's used, being mindful of our thought process and then connecting our thoughts to our emotions, how we interpret events, and then taking a step back and saying, all right, you know, I said hey to that person, that neighbor, when I was walking to the mailbox, and they didn't seem to return my greeting. You know what a loser I am. So there's a cascade of negative. They know I'm a loser. They hate me. They, you know, I'm so unimportant and horrible and, you know, whatever. It's like, okay, well, let's treat those as just one possible set of interpretations, not as fact. Because when we have an interpretation, we just treat it as gospel truth. It's like, that's the only possible way things could be. Of course they hate me and they could tell I'm a loser and, you know, whatever. And then cognitive therapy would say, well, no, let's treat that as one hypothesis. Let's see if we can generate alternative hypotheses like, oh, well, maybe they were distracted. Maybe they had something on their mind. Maybe they didn't see me. Maybe they didn't, you know, we could do that. Or let's examine evidence What have been the last 10 interactions with that neighbor? Oh, they, brought you, a meal when your mother-in-law died, and, they were thoughtful, and it's like, oh, maybe they don't hate me, right? I mean, so it's a useful set of techniques.
Yeah.
But it has limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was discovering, especially as a clinical neuroscientist, is the depressed brain is often an inflamed brain.
Mm-hmm.
And people with depression often have altered body clock function, circadian signaling, circadian rhythms. And that then messes with their sleep, which then messes with their serotonergic signaling and dopamine. So serotonin, dopamine, everybody knows about those allegedly feel-good brain chemicals, but they're important, in our functioning. They often have nutritional deficits.
Mm-hmm.
They often have, here's one. They often have problems with having enough energy supply in their brain cells.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
the brain doesn't use glucose properly, doesn't get enough glucose, even though their blood sugar may be high. Glucose is just, the form of sugar that we talk about as being biologically active and available. So their blood glucose could be high, but they're not getting that glucose in the brain. Or they get that glucose in the brain, but they don't have the right chemical key to unlock it, insulin. So the insulin receptors are not, they're pre-diabetic in their brain. So now the glucose gets in there, but the brain can't use it. Or down to a molecular level, the power plant of the brain, the mitochondria,
Right.
are, not healthy. And they may be degrading, maybe because they don't have enough antioxidants. So there are these reactive oxygenated. I mean, we could go down, a very, very deep rabbit hole there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just like, all right, well, Aaron Beck, he got a lot right about negative thinking and depression, but he didn't talk about any of this shit.
Right.
It matters a
It
lot.
matters. Yes.
And and then I stumbled across a really interesting case report from an anthropologist named Edward Schieffelin, who back in the 80s had spent about a decade with a hunter-gatherer band in Papua New Guinea in the highlands called the Kaluli people. And Schieffelin was really interested in forms of psychological disorder in other non-Western cultures, but particularly what we think of as more Aboriginal group who, it turns out lived in a lot of ways lives that are much more similar to those of our ancestors. So think about sort of evolutionary selection pressure, the kind of world, the sort of Stone Age Pleistocene world that was the crucible within which anatomically modern Homo sapiens evolved. And the world has changed, obviously, very rapidly since then. And since the Industrial Revolution, just 8-9 generations, it's become unrecognizable. And there hasn't been time for any evolution. We still have the same basic genes, building the same basic brains as, say, folks 250 years ago in colonial America or, any other part of the world. And yet we live such radically different lives. Mm-hmm. So, when I read about the Kaluli and the fact that they hardly ever get depressed, I was like, wait, what? And I read, a little more deeply, and it's like, well, they get bereaved when they lose a loved one. They have all these, really, I would say, very emotionally healthy ceremonies of bereavement and grieving the dead, their loved one, but they can still function, and they derive enormous comfort and healing and support, and then they can move on, still remembering, the dearly departed, but they're present, for them. Because they've grieved, I think in a really healthy way, but they don't get just shut down like we do out of the blue. And as a depression researcher, this is like 2003, 2004. I'm looking at the data and it's like, my God, like pretty soon it's going to be 1 out of 3 Americans are getting struck down by this. I mean, we're talking disabling illness. The technical term, of course, is major depressive disorder, right? Major clinical depression, I call it depressive illness often. And it's like, well, this is nuts because like we've had a 300% increase in medication use and psychotherapy is still being widely used and we're becoming more materially affluent as a country. And the rate of depression just keeps going up, 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 up.
Yeah.
So what the hell's going on? It's clearly not a Prozac deficiency or, I mean, depending on exactly which population survey you trust the most, I tend to trust the one that says roughly 1 out of 7 American adults has taken an antidepressant in the last month. 1 out of 7.
Wow.
And it's roughly 400% or fourfold increase since 1990.
Wow.
And this, how about this? The social burden of depression keeps going up. And we're throwing a mountain of medication at it, and it hasn't moved the needle. I mean, I use that with my students, where I say, all right, let me stipulate, and it's time for me to stipulate this. I'm not anti-medication. I'm not anti-medication. I am very in favor of anything that will be helpful.
Yeah.
But I think we need to be honest.
Yeah.
I think we need to be honest and realistic about what the current meds can't do. I actually believe that probably by 2050, assuming we still have civilization in 2050, I think there will be psychiatric meds that are so much more effective. We'll look back on this as the dark ages. And people will be like, oh my God, I cannot believe you were just throwing an antidepressant at somebody without taking into account like what was going on with their gut-brain axis and what were their genetics and wait, what about the dosage and like, are they a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer? You weren't checking their blood levels. You weren't like, people are going to be like, you're just freaking throwing darts in an unlit closet at a dartboard, and just hoping that you maybe hit the dartboard somewhere.
Yeah.
And then you turn the light on and you look and you're like, oh, well, we almost got the dartboard. So as a researcher looking at all that and then stumbling across the Kaluli, it was an epiphany. It was like a light bulb moment where I'm like, oh, depression fits a pattern of diseases of civilization. Diseases, and by the way, there are dozens of these diseases that are endemic and very common in affluent, industrialized, wealthy, sedentary, fast food laden indoor kinds of societies, and largely non-existent among Aboriginal groups who still live like our ancestors lived for tens of thousands of years. And, for folks who are curious, like atherosclerosis or, hardening of the arteries would be another disease of civilization, diabetes, obesity, tooth decay, largely, hemorrhoids, interestingly, only occur in populations that sit a lot. Asthma, I mean, go on and on. Many cancers, it turns out, are virtually unknown in Aboriginal groups, not because they allegedly die when they're 25 or 30.
Right.
If they survive childhood, they typically will live into their 70s or so they experience old age, but they remain fit and active and vigorous in old age. And so that was like a light bulb went on for me. And I was like, okay, if depression is largely a disease of civilization, then well, what are the Kaluli doing that's protecting? Because their lives are difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they may live into old age, but they don't have modern medicine.
Right.
They will occasionally have a week or two where there's no available food supply, and they'll just, be fasting involuntarily for a week or two.
Wow.
They have a pretty high rate of death due to intergroup conflict. So, basically limited sort of skirmishes, warfare with hostile outgroups.
Yeah.
Which, was probably part of it. Well, we know from the fossil record of lots of bashed in skulls and other, intergroup conflict has been part of the, human condition for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrible. And it is you'd think, a really big trigger for clinical depression. But the Kaluli don't seem to get depressed because they're protected.
Mm-hmm.
What protects them? They don't do psychotherapy. They don't take meds. It's their lifestyle.
Yeah.
What makes us so vulnerable that, we've had a 400% increase in antidepressant use, and yet the rate of depression keeps going up, and especially in our young people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, we've left behind everything that protected nearly everything that protected the Kaluli, and we've added some new things that are psychologically toxic. So what I, tell my students is like, look, we have really strong scientific evidence that a lot of 21st century American life is psychologically toxic. And we need to also reclaim some healing habits of the past and weave them into the fabric of day-to-day life in the present. And they're like, well, so are you like the Unabomber or something? Do you want to? It's like, no, clearly I do not live in a cabin in Montana. I have no designs on. It's like I'm not a big fan of superhuman AI. I'll lay my cards on the table. I think we need to slow that shit down till we can be sure we get it done right and safely. But in general, I'm a big fan of technology and a big fan of modernity. A big fan of modern medicine, big fan of anesthesia when you need to, big fan of antibiotics when you have, I think I'd be dead, honestly, without modern medicine.
Yeah.
But I want us to have our cake and eat it too. I want people to keep their laptops, keep their mocha latte, but also be really smart and leverage things from the past that we know are antidepressant and anti-anxiety and protect us from brain aging and storage of dementia and, help with our focus and attention. So I know that's a lot, but.
No, I was thinking in the first edition of The Depression Cure that came out in 2009, and you've got your next edition that just got released August 5th. You had said,
well, we'll see.
We'll see.
I from your lips to God's ears, I don't know if it's actually going to drop on August 5th or not. Publishers I shouldn't even be bringing this up, but they don't always hit their targets. How about that?
Okay, good. That's
so
sufficient.
I don't want anybody to, if they hear this, I don't know when this episode is gonna drop, but if it's like mid-August or late August or September or whatever.
Okay.
Can I tell them? We're recording this on July 26th, so you can edit that out if you need. But,
no, it's fine.
But I don't want them to be disappointed if they're like Amazon. It's like, it's number one now or whatever. Sometime very soon.
Sometime very soon. Okay. Well, you said that the TLC addresses the modern depression epidemic at its source, the fact that human beings are not designed for the poorly nourished, sedentary, indoor, sleep-deprived, socially isolated, frenzied pace of 21st century life. Is there anything that you would add to that sentence today versus 16 years ago?
Oh, that's good. I like that question a lot. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, in a broader sort of framing, that question could be interpreted as like, well, did you need a second edition of the book? So the first edition came out 16 years ago. What has changed? And to unpack that question, I love the question. To unpack it, I think the first part A for me is, has the science changed on anything that I recommended in the first edition?
Mm-hmm.
Was there something that we thought 16 years ago that was helpful that now, with better studies, this happens all the time in science, by the way.
Sure.
With better studies, it's like, oh, well, maybe high dose omega-3 fats are not as antidepressant as we thought. Turns out they are, thankfully. It turns out everything that was part of the core set of recommendations 16 years ago has stood the test of time pretty well.
Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to explore life with you. We encourage curiosity, self-growth, and we strive to be more compassionate every day.